Works program will do for America. It wasn't just that it provided jobs for people. The WPA did a lot of other things other than that. It created a tremendous opportunity for organizing where African American workers demanded equal pay with white workers and won it. That would have been completely unthought of in the private sector at that time. And unlike the government. So it was a very broad-based and progressive movement. But it wasn't just as simple as we had a government jobs program. There were really 4 phases of unemployed organizing during the Depression. The first phase was the early organizing under Hoover. You had unemployed marches. Local committees were set up in every neighborhood throughout big cities in the United States. In every community, you had local committees meeting on a weekly basis. Then there was the Veterans Bonus March. For those of you who don't know, we'll look at some images in here. So it's part of an ongoing movement all throughout the 1930s. Here you see the various early beginnings of the unemployed movement. The Communist Party, which had very, very few members in the United States, holds a series of hunger marches actually throughout the world. The hunger marches are overwhelmingly popular. Hundreds, and in New York, thousands come out. And the Communist Party is overwhelmed. They did not anticipate this kind of response. The police respond with a lot of brutality. Here you see the headline in the New York Times, Reds battle police in Union Square, scores injured, leaders are seized, 2 dead, many hurt in clashes abroad. So this is the beginning of the movement. Before this, you had small local organizing going on. Many of you may have heard of the rent strikes, where when people were being evicted, the unemployed organizations would go in and move people's stuff back into their apartments, break the locks. But this is not really the beginning of the mass demonstrations, and hunger marches are held every single year. But it's not just hunger marches. Here you have a local unemployed demonstration outside City Hall in St. Louis, and I'm trying to show you the geographic breadth of the movement. This is absolutely a national movement. Workers are occupying the chambers of City Hall. This is very important. Over and over again, we're going to see demonstrations as occupations, demanding food and relief for the unemployed. Look at the mass number of people who are participating in this, right? I don't know if you can see on the sign, it says the bosses and the government are the problem. The bosses and the government, we demand relief, right? So the bosses and the government in the early days of the movement are seen as intricately linked. And then as the movement goes on, and the movement is able to force the government to actually act in the interests of the people rather than in the interests of private business, which of course is what we're seeing today, then people start to pressure the government for more and more. Here's just a sense of how broad the marches are. This is from the Chicago Defender in 1931. Chicago Reds, these are the hunger marches. So in 1931, you have another wave of hunger marches. Again, you have violence by the police. Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, Chicago, thousands of people out in the streets, right? In Los Angeles, you have demonstrations aimed to marshal 25,000 of the unemployed of the city. So there's an upsurge of anger. Now, again, the day-to-day meetings is probably a crowd like us. But once a year, you get to these large demonstrations, and as the local meetings go on, week after week, you're able to mobilize actions at a local level where hundreds, if not thousands, of people are coming out. Here's another example I wanted to show you the localized nature of this movement. 15,000 unemployed and hunger-striking miners, because remember, the mines were hit in the 20s, so by the time you get to the early 30s, the miners are desperate. Hunger-striking miners who marched to the county courthouse in Washington, Pennsylvania. This is not a big metropolis, right? And yet they have mobilized 15,000 people to demand relief. Now, relief is what we consider unemployed compensation, right? Now, what's so important about looking at these images is we learn so much about a movement by looking at the pictures. We can see the leadership is black and white together, very much emblematic of what was going on in the mining communities of Pennsylvania at that time, and continues to be black leadership in the unemployed movement throughout the mining districts. You can see how orderly they are, marching in a line down the street. The use of the American flag in protest, of course, is very important in this period. It's actually, in many cases, legal ordinance. Tips the balance. I know I'm short on time, but this is the leaflet that's sent out about the Veterans Bonus March, making the demands for it. And you can come up and look at my images later. This is the demonstration outside of Congress demanding the bonus. And the point is, I want to show you the scope of the movement. North Carolina, New Mexico, Georgia, Wisconsin, right? This is a mass movement, and people came with their families. There were a lot of kids camped out in the encampment, a lot of women were there. They set up their own city. And it's interesting to think about this occupation in Washington, D.C. as kind of people coming and saying, this reminds us of Egypt a little bit, we're going to stay until we get our bonus. We're not leaving. And then even when Congress votes against the bonus, the demonstrators say, we're not leaving until we get the bonus. You're not going to turn us around. And these people came in cars and they marched all the way to Washington from all throughout the country. This is a picture of the camp. It was set up. You can see how disciplined and orderly it was, right? And then you start to see the conflict. Soldiers in gas masks advance into the camps. And again, look at who the bonus marchers are. Largely a big mix of African American and white veterans together. Right? You see that again and again and again throughout the movement. They are bringing tanks and tear gas. This is right downtown in D.C. Federal workers come out of their offices and are booing the tanks as they're going down to remove the veterans. This is a decisive moment in Hoover's administration. When Roosevelt hears about this, he chuckles and says, well, I guess I'm going to be the next president. This turns the tide about what is possible to do to the unemployed. I think this is a particularly poignant picture because as you see them burning the veterans encampment, you can have the Capitol looming in the background, right? This is the message that goes out to the world about what happens to the unemployed in the United States. It also shows how far the protesters are prepared to go. So of course, when Roosevelt is elected, he wants to make sure there's not another Veterans Bonus March, right? He wants to show himself as being the leader who's on the side of the unemployed. So he had set up a government jobs program demanding more jobs in CWA. In New York City, the next week, people march on the streets saying, Minneapolis first, New York City next. But in fact, the next massive protest actually breaks out in Kansas, demanding more jobs. There's national protests saying the government hasn't gone far enough, the government hasn't done enough, we need more jobs. And at the same time, the unemployed that get jobs on the CWA start setting up unions the first day on the job. They understand the opportunity is there, right? They're going to get higher wages, they're going to demand better working conditions. The government shuts down the CWA program in the spring of 1934 because they're terrified of what this program could mean. And there's protests all over the country. Mayors' committees, thousands of letters come into Washington demanding the program be restarted. But the program doesn't get restarted because the unemployed movement is fragmented into different factions and cannot unify and make a unified demand of the government. And they decide they're not going to make this mistake again. So the unemployed workers movement begins to unify, and they unify around the tactic of state occupations. Because what the federal government decides to do is to federally set up a WPA program and then throw the whole issue of relief back to the states. And the states, of course, refuse to provide money for relief. So the unemployed movement responds to this problem by occupying state houses all across the country. In total, there are 12 state occupations. WPA strike, army, ousted by police, evacuates Capitol. This is warfare going on in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, in Missouri, state house after state house, New Jersey. They occupy the state house in New Jersey. And the event in Trenton is actually organized by an actor. Okay? And he sets up the event. The movement takes the state house, occupies the legislators' seats, right? And then they do this little play acting thing, and thousands of people crowd the State House to try to see the action going on in the chambers. And first they pretend to be the legislators, like the fat guy with the cigar, like, I'm representing Senator so-and-so from South Jersey who doesn't give a shit about us, right? And then after they do that whole game, then they say, all right, now let's be serious, now let's be ourselves and pass the legislation that we really need. So they're playing this dual role back and forth. So you can see the occupations taking place. We won't move, and you can't make us. These occupations are very threatening, and the federal government feels pressure to try to take things more and more out of the state hands and do things on a federal level. This is a picture of the occupation of the New Jersey